Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first 2022 webinar. My name is Taylor Jackson, and I am Director of SC Logistics, which is part of the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness. A few reminders: this meeting will be recorded and shared on our website and YouTube channel. Please ask any questions through the chat function, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Also, save the date for you guys is our annual South Carolina Logistics Tech Talk will be held at Trident Tech Aeronautical Center on April 19th in North Charleston this year. So please stay tuned for updates on that, including sponsorships. This morning, we have Priyesh Ranjan joining us today from Vorto. As CEO, Priyesh is responsible for leading, directing, and executing Vorto and their growth strategy. Prior to joining Vorto, Priyesh held positions of increased leadership responsibility across strategy, business development, technology solutions, and operations. Vorto's mission is to enable businesses to be more economically and environmentally sustainable by digitally transforming the supply chain. So I think for better or worse, I think we can all acknowledge that COVID-19 impacted the supply chain in a huge way. Increased demand exposed weak points in what had been a fairly reliable process of shipping goods. So I want to thank Priyesh for joining us today, and I will turn it over to him to kind of walk us through Vorto and the way that they can reduce your supply chain spend by 40%. So Priyesh, I will turn it over to you and let you share your screen and get started.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Just a second. And move this. There we go. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
So a few things I'll talk about today. I was kind of thinking about this over the week on what topic to share and kind of what to share with regards to what we all have learned during COVID as well as before COVID. And one of the topic that has been front and center for, I would say, the last few years, but has got phenomenally, has got a lot of shining light on it recently, has been driver shortage in America. And kind of, I want to kind of share with you all what our learnings have been and how we have been solving for driver shortage. And I would also make a pretty controversial point that actually there is no driver shortage. So I'm going to share with you some data that we have collected over the last 3 to 4 years on our platform. And then I'll also share some of the learnings that hopefully would be valuable to you all as you all develop the supply chain strategies for your companies. So this topic of driver shortage is not a new topic. If you can see this graph on the right side, there has been driver shortage discussions happening all the way since 2011. Obviously, this got pretty evident during COVID for many reasons, right? With all the supply chain disruptions, a lot of drivers leaving the industry, a lot of aging drivers leaving the industry. So if you kind of look at this projection, we'll be short by close to 160,000 drivers by 2028. So this thing the graph kind of paints a picture that things are going to get worse and worse and worse, right? And I'll kind of make an argument here that actually we have never had driver shortage. We've always had driver surplus. I would even make the argument that when we are short by 160,000 drivers in 2028, we still will have a driver surplus. And to make that argument, here's a very good piece of data to kind of see. We launched this, we've been in this play for well before my time. Vorto has been doing this for about, I would say about 7 years. I came in 2018. And so we have a lot of data that we have collected over the years to really understand. Let me try to move the screen. Can you all see my screen?
No, we lost it.
One sec, something went wrong.
Perfect.
Am I back? Yeah.
You're back.
Okay. So here's a good piece of data that kind of shows you the amount of time that gets wasted in the life of a driver. The amount of time they waste in deadhead. Deadhead is the empty miles that they drive. The amount of time they waste in idle time, which is basically the time they are waiting to get a shipment, or their time that they're waiting at a drop-off location or a pickup location. The amount of time they spend on back office just to collect the money that they deserve. Just to give you some ballpark numbers on our platform, typically when a driver can work 12 hours a day, they would actually be working 6 hours a day. 6 of their other hours would just get wasted, and would get wasted due to all the inefficiencies that supply chain brings, right? Between the shippers, the carriers, the suppliers, the pickup locations, the drop-off locations, the traffic, and so on and so forth. So if you kind of look at this, it's a phenomenally underutilized resource. And that's the reason why we needed such driver surplus, right? And that is the reason why trucking is such a volatile industry over the last few years. Why drivers are starting to notice that they can get more stable, better paying jobs by being outside the trucking industry. Hence, you're finding this exodus of drivers, especially from the younger generation, not wanting to join because of these inefficiencies, right? So kind of what I'm going to talk about today is like, why are we having these levels of inefficiencies? Why are drivers so underutilized? And then how are we leveraging AI to solve for this problem, to eliminate driver shortage? So the first statement I'll make is supply chain is too dynamic. If we try to solve it ourselves and we do not use automation, we do not use AI, the person that will suffer the most is a driver. It's almost like if we gave our 401k to a lot of people in a control tower, and we ask people to control our destiny. And that's basically what happens. You know, with all these control towers we create at the shipper level, at the broker level, at the carrier level, the person that gets hurt the most is the driver. The volatility that it creates, the inconsistent work that they get, the amount of time that they waste. And that is the reason why you end up seeing drivers jumping between companies. That is the reason why you see the churn rate in a traditional carrier is about 90%. And that all happens because we use these solutions that actually don't solve for the problem. So one of the most common solution is this evolution of digitization. I'm sure you will see a lot of these pictures if you go to a shipper, a broker, a carrier with hundreds of screens, different data that they are looking at. What it actually does, so when I inherited Vorto, we had control towers like this in different states and different cities. And I personally tried to go in and actually be a dispatcher. I personally tried to go in and be a logistics coordinator. And very quickly, what I learned is the cognitive overload that data creates is we as human beings cannot do that much math. Supply chain is only math. And it's math that needs to happen 24/7. The best time I can do math is 2 coffees in the morning for about 30 minutes, and the rest of the day I'm just dragging myself. So for human beings to be able to do this level of complex problem solving, and that to 24/7, any math that you do and you make a decision, 30 seconds later, a minute later, your decision is too late. So the decision has changed again. So you're always chasing your tail in these control towers, which creates a phenomenal amount of inefficiency. Now you overcomplicate this with this picture. You'll kind of see this interaction is phenomenally complicated. Shippers are making decisions on where to pick up their materials, where to drop it off to their customers. Carriers are making decisions on how to make their business profitable. Dispatchers and driver recruiting and driver management organizations are making decisions with their own KPIs. In fact, driver recruiting they prefer drivers to quit so that they can make more money by hiring more drivers. Dispatchers are dispatching drivers that they have better relationships with. So they are basically non-optimizing the entire driver base because of that preferential relationship. And then you have this whole convoluted web of billing departments where a driver is trying to ask for what he's owed, and has to go through this whole bunch of roadblocks just to get paid. And sometimes you get paid, sometimes you get paid in weeks, sometimes you get paid in months. If you take this level of chaos, then it clearly makes sense why we are having a driver shortage. We're not having a driver shortage. As I mentioned, we already have a very poor utilization. What we are having is an exodus of drivers leaving this industry because this level of complexity and chaos doesn't exist in other sectors, and from an employment perspective, right? You can actually go get jobs today in America, in other sectors. I'm sure, like, just take our jobs. We don't go through this level of complexity. Our salary doesn't change every 1 month or every 1 week. These people's salary changes every week because of this complexity, because their utilization rate changes. These people sometimes don't get their pay, whereas we are so used to every 2 weeks, we look at our bank account and we get paid. So the point I'm making here is digital solutions of bringing visibility and looking at where your truck is, hundreds of trucks on a map, just creates cognitive overload. It solves nothing. And then having manual interaction between all these different groups, the shipper, the carrier, the dispatcher, the driver, the billing, the payroll. It's almost like if you're trying to communicate to me and 7 people are in between you and me to communicate to me, right? So what I'm going to share today is how we have leveraged AI to get rid of these control towers, get rid of looking at visibility, ETA, where is the truck? There is no point for us to look at where the truck is on the map. A computer can make that decision much better on when to reroute a truck, when to get the truck delivered on time. If we look at it, we are just going to make non-optimized decisions. Human beings typically can only comprehend 3 things at a time. Computers can comprehend 1 million constraints at a time. And we're going to kind of share with you how we have transitioned from control towers to fully automated platforms using AI, and then how we have removed all these silos and these different communication gaps that happen between different groups to create stability in a driver's life and be able to reduce the driver churn and create stability for shippers and reduce the shipping costs for shippers. So how did we do that? That comes down to just 3 things. If supply chain needs these 3 things, it's phenomenally important to predict what's going to go wrong. In other words, it's very important to have a crystal ball. AI does a really good job with crystal balls because AI is able to learn from a lot of experiences. I'm 38 years old. There's only so many experiences I have. I need to live another few hundred years to even compete with a machine. A machine gets to the same level of wisdom in learning in 5 minutes that it'll take me if I lived for 400 years, right? Because as I mentioned, the machine doesn't have any issues with speed, doesn't have any issues with cognitive overload, and doesn't have any issues with learning millions of parameters, whereas we as human beings can only take 3 things at a time, right? So that's the reason why it's very hard for us to predict the future, and it gets very easy for machines to predict the future. The second one is dynamic decision making. Supply chain is too complex. Dwell times change, wait times at a pickup location change, wait times at a drop-off location change. Our customers' needs change, so they may be buying something else, now they want something else. COVID is a really good example, right? Food started transitioning from the restaurant industry suddenly to the groceries, and the entire supply chain industry could not react to it because suddenly the entire network of distribution changed. And now control tower, human beings were trying to make these decisions every minute, every second, whereas for a machine, it really doesn't matter. A machine changes its decision every microsecond, right? And then automated communication. If you change your decision so fast, you can't manually communicate that. Because if you did that, you will never get off the phone. You will always be on the phone. So when decisions are getting taken so quickly, the communication has to be automated. And if the communication has to be direct to the driver, something has to be in the driver's hand where he needs to know or she needs to know what has changed in microseconds. But if there is a link of phone calls that has to happen between a shipper, to a broker, to a carrier, to a dispatcher, to an agent, all the way to a driver, it's too late. By the time you got that point across to the driver, the decision has changed again, right? So one of the things we'll kind of share with you is how we used AI to predict the future, how we used AI to constantly change decisions, and how we leverage automated communications so that the engine kept moving, right? So that the whole supply chain reconfigured, recalibrated itself without us having to pick up those phone calls. And when I'll summarize this, what you will see, it creates a very symbiotic relationship. It increases driver utilization. In other words, it increases the income for drivers, so carriers get stable. And very interestingly, it reduces the cost inflation for shippers. As you all know, there has been a lot of cost inflation over the last 2 years, especially in the trucking industry for shippers, and that's all been driven through driver churn and driver shortage. And I'll kind of share with you, as soon as you stabilize the world of drivers, you end up stabilizing shipping and your cost inflation goes away. It's kind of misunderstood. Traditionally, people always thought cost inflation is driven by carriers. Carrier is just a middleman. Carrier is just sitting here. All that happens is here. It's all at the driver level, right? Those assets are assets. Assets are not moody. The truck is a truck. It's going to be there in your parking lot whenever you need it. A trailer is a trailer. It's going to be there whenever you need it. It's the driver. If the driver leaves, the truck is of no use. So the whole point that we'll drive is our learning is focus on the drivers and fix that problem, and that fixes the entire supply chain. Okay. So first case study, I'm going to talk through 2 case studies. I'm going to show one case study, which is about short hauls. And then I'm going to talk about a second case study, which is over the road, long haul. Okay. They have very different dynamics. In the short haul world, trucking is done very regionally, right? Drivers go back and forth between multiple pickup and drop off locations. And then they typically live in the same city where they do their work. Okay. In long haul, they go across the country, right? So they go coast to coast. The way we have gone about optimizing that with AI has been quite different because the dynamics in the long haul world are very different than the dynamics of the short haul world. So I'll show you one for short haul and then I'll show you one for long haul. So here's short haul. This is kind of what the world of short haul looks like. What you're seeing on the left side are suppliers, shippers, and carriers. Carriers are basically those drivers in the middle, right? And this could look like inbound, it could be outbound. You can make these networks. It's a network, right? It's a network of drivers going between picking up raw material from an inbound supplier, delivering it to a plant of a shipper, or going from a shipper to a customer outbound. But you always have this convoluted network of different pickup locations and different drop-off locations. Okay. When you have this level of complexity, the world changes, right? Your customer's need may change. So in other words, you may need a different raw material to get picked up because they don't want the product that they asked for. So suddenly now you have to go and change your sourcing. So different suppliers have to get sourced. That means, again, different carriers have to get picked. That means, again, a driver has to be told that he has to go to a different supplier. The same thing can happen outbound, right? Restaurant industry, the food industry. Instead of going to restaurants, now they had to go to Whole Foods, to Kroger, different groceries, right? Because the restaurants were closed, right? Those dynamic decisions that get taken means a series of decisions have to change across sourcing, across carriers, across logistics, across drivers. And that's where all the inefficiencies get created. So the first place where we learned all the inefficiencies get created happen at the shipper level. So those control towers that you see, those control towers are where all the scheduling happens, where a shipper says, I want to move 40 loads of shipments from this place to this place, inbound and then outbound. Well, when you do that, the person sitting there does not know what the wait times are at those different locations. The person sitting there is not doing a calculation that if 40 trucks get there, the 40th truck is going to be in line and is actually going to clock out before that person even gets a chance to pick up his product. The person sitting in the control tower has no idea of what the traffic would look like if those things need to be sent right now, or should they be staggered in the future? Should they manage inventory on location differently so that we don't constantly restock and create inefficiencies with drivers, right? It's because there's too much math, there's too many parameters that I'm sharing with you. So what happens is, because of that, poor carrier selection takes place, and that creates deadhead for drivers. Now you've picked a driver. The way we do carrier selection typically is either done by cost or it's done by regionality. The reason we do it by cost or regionality, because as I mentioned, a human brain can only think about three things at a time. So we simplify the problem and we say, let's go do it this way. Well, when we simplify a problem, all we do is we induce inefficiencies in the supply chain for the drivers, right? And then there's this whole concept called reaction time, which is an even more complicated problem. So supply chain changes, a supply node falls off. For example, a supplier says, I cannot meet this pickup time, or my plant is down. I cannot meet this requirement for these products. Now you have to react and change your entire supply network, and you have to react and change your tendering to the carriers. And then the carriers have to react and change the dispatching to the drivers. The reaction time is so phenomenally slow because somebody has to do the math, somebody has to pick up a phone, then somebody has to again do the math, pick up a phone, and you have all these cascading effects that happen between the shipper and the carrier, which now creates additional dwell time, additional deadhead, and additional wastage of HOS hours for the drivers. And all these inefficiencies I just mentioned were just at the shipper level. So, if you are a shipper, this is the inefficiencies just induced by your organization into the system. Now, let's further compound that inefficiencies. After you have given those inefficiencies to the carrier, now the carrier is compounding those inefficiencies by wrongly selecting the driver. Which driver should be selected? Let me give you a simple example. Traditionally, the way drivers get selected is they get selected by either the relationship to the dispatcher or by the distance of the driver, who's closer. Well, if you keep selecting the driver who's closer, you will get into a situation where some drivers will make a lot more money than some drivers, right? Because shipments are not equal. It's not a homogeneous system. Shipments don't come out everywhere equally. Well, when you do that, and some drivers make more money and some drivers make less money, what happens to the drivers who make less money? They quit. It's the exact same thing we do in our jobs, right? If we find out that we are doing a job and our peers are constantly making more money, we are doing the same amount of work, right? Or we are not getting enough opportunities to make more money, we quit. We go to some other company. So see how complicated it gets. A dispatcher can't be sitting there and calculating the trailing salary of a driver 3 months out and saying, oh, this driver has not been making enough money, so I have to figure out how to give this load to this driver. Whereas the computer can do all these things at all times, right? It can create a level of equality across everybody. And then the slow reaction time, same concept, right? The same slow reaction time that shippers have, carriers have in reacting to changes in the supply chain network. So if you look at this complexity between shippers, carriers, and suppliers who are basically providing you the product. When in the outbound world, you are the supplier and your customer is the shipper, so to speak. In the inbound world, you are the shipper and your supplier is your vendor, right? When you take these inefficiencies that are happening between the three organizations, all it does is sacrifices the driver. It increases the idle time of a driver. That means the time a driver waits around to find good shipments. It increases the dwell time of a driver, the time a driver wastes at a pickup location or a drop-off location. And it increases the deadhead miles the driver drives, which has further implications with carbon emission and so on and so forth. So this is the problem in a short-haul world that needs to get solved. So what are we solving? In the short-haul world, the way we went about solving it is we realized there are three players that have to be on the same page, because all of those three players have different decisions that keep changing, and then the system needs to recalibrate within a microsecond. So the way to look at that is this triangle. Shipper is you. This is an inbound example. So shipper is you, supplier is your suppliers, and logistics is these are drivers using an app, right? Outbound world, this triangle would look like the shipper will become your customer, supplier will become you, and then the carrier will be a carrier, right? And kind of what we did here is the software predicted the demand of the shipper. So there is no control tower that is predicting what you will need. There is a software that is predicting thousands of SKUs of raw materials that you need for your production plant, and is managing your inventory dynamically, right? It's not just refilling every inventory for no reason. It's basically evaluating what your sales is to your customers, and it's managing the right inventory levels for each raw material for your production plant, right? In order to manage that, it's sourcing products from suppliers. So suppliers are also on the same software. So they're seeing a forecast. So what the supplier is seeing is they're seeing a forecast on what the computer is planning to order from them in the future. And the suppliers are interacting with that software. They're telling the software if they can meet those forecasts, if they cannot meet those forecasts. And if they can't meet those forecasts, the software is automatically going and sourcing it from other suppliers within your network so that it can balance your portfolio of raw materials that are coming into your production plants. And then the logistics providers, there is no TMS, there is no billing, and all those aspects that you have to live through. It's going direct to the driver, right? It's paying the carrier, but all the communication it's just circumventing direct to the driver, and it's managing those drivers so that their utilization rate goes up, right? So the way to think about this is 3 parties are on the same page now. If your customer changes this mind, all that happens at the shipper level is the raw materials demand in the future changes, which automatically changes the sourcing with the suppliers within a microsecond, which automatically changes what the driver needs to do within a microsecond. So the world can keep changing. You can have to go from the restaurant industry to the grocery industry, or in the car industry, your raw material specs could change. You could be picking up raw materials from different ports. In the car industry, you're delivering cars to different distribution hubs. So that could change, right? So anything can change, but nobody has to pick up the phone. The entire system between you, supplier, and logistics, or you, your customer, and logistics recalibrates within a microsecond. When that happens, this is what happens. We launched this platform in 2018. To give you some background, we actually used to be a transportation management software company. We were actually that control tower. We used to provide managed trucking. And whenever I looked at our business, I just saw we just need hundreds of dispatchers, hundreds of logistics coordinators. And we did a back of the napkin math. And we said to move 0.1% of trucking in America, we would need 5,000 dispatchers. And that's where the aha moment happened, that this is a phenomenally inefficient system. We have to figure out a way to create an automated platform because supply chain is too dynamic. So when we launched this platform I was showing you in 2018, in 1 year, to our surprise, we did about $2.3 billion of spend on our platform. And we were able to do the same amount of volume of trucking with 66% less trucks. And the reason we were able to do it with 66% less trucks is the driver utilization rate went up. The deadhead of the drivers reduced. The idle time of the drivers reduced. The volatility in their income reduced. So their churn reduced. That means the carrier capacity got stable. And what you're seeing is 2 graphs, one on the left, one on the right. So this is a case study that we applied with shippers. So the left graph, what you're seeing, is we allowed the control towers to make decisions, right? And that is kind of how today people do. They have something from their ERP system coming in. They'll have a TMS. They'll have all these Google Docs, spreadsheets. They're making these phone calls, and they're trying to make these decisions, right? And then our software has visibility. Like you must have heard, there are lots of visibility softwares where basically you can see where your truck is. It's called trucks on a map. So you know the ETA of your trucks between different nodes, from the port to the warehouse, from the warehouse to your plant, all those kinds of things, right? So we provided that visibility, right? And we turned it on and we said, let's make decisions. Let the control tower make decisions, right? And then we said, go ahead and press autopilot and walk away. As soon as we pressed autopilot and we walked away, the driver utilization went off the chain. In other words, we started needing less drivers and less trucks to do the same work because the software started recalibrating and rehealing itself in microseconds. Supply chain is like this, it's like this weird network that is always imbalanced. And human beings are always chasing it to reheal it, rebalance it. You rebalance it, within a minute, it gets imbalanced again. Well, a computer does it in microseconds, so it keeps it balanced. And that's why we were able to do this with 66% less trucks. In addition to that, there was this concept called dwell time, which is this concept where drivers have to wait at pickup locations or drop-off locations because they're in a queue to drop off. That creates a lot of inefficiencies, right? Because now shipper is having to pay a fine, but a driver is not making the same amount of money by waiting versus the money he makes while he's driving loaded, right? So the same thing happened. We, when we went from manual to letting people make decisions with visibility to pressing autopilot. And whenever I make this comment, I make this with a lot of humility. Please don't take this that we are making this comment that people can't make decisions. I'm a human being. We all are human beings. This is too complex. This is too complex for us to make because there are too many variables, and there are too many variables that are changing too much. So whenever I make that comment, it's not as any any attack on ourselves. It's just me saying this. It's like trying to do day trading manually. I don't know if anyone of you has tried day trading, but in day trading, the stock price changes so quickly that you have to recalculate your decision and buy or sell without that change. Supply chain is exactly like that. It's like day trading, and only a computer can do it. Now I want to show you shipper side. So what I showed you is we were able to do this with 66% less trucks. It was very valuable to the drivers. Their utilization went up, and they were very happy. Look at the value it created for a shipper. Here's a case study. When I got into this, I'll be very honest, I'm not a supply chain person. I have no knowledge about supply chain when I entered this sector 4 years ago. My thought was, so it just happens, right? I'm an AI engineer. I'm a computer geek. I just like solving complex problems. So I didn't have an appreciation on what I was solving. And my initial thought was, from what I was hearing from shippers, I think we're solving for automation. In other words, reducing cost of people, right, making these decisions. So what you see in this graph is a very interesting graph that, to our surprise, that was not what we were solving for. The first biggest saving was actually line haul. When we increased the utilization rate of the drivers and the trucks, the shippers went back to the carriers and dropped the line haul by 20%. If you drop a line haul by 20% of any enterprise, that's typically a few $100 million, especially Fortune 100 commodity companies. In the commodity industries, we were heavily focused on the oil and gas and the commodity industry, like food processing, ag, stuff like that. In the commodity industry, transportation is the biggest spend, or a very large portion of the spend of their total landed cost of their entire service. So the service that they provide to their customer, transportation is a very big piece of it. So when you take 20% of that, that is a level of savings that they can never create by increasing their price in the market, because they are in a commodity industry. If they increase the price of their market, they'll price themselves out of the market, right? And then you can kind of see all these layers of total landed cost reduced, detention went away, stockouts went away. And then there's this small piece where 95% of the control tower got automated, right? But while they got automated, it's not that they lost their jobs. They just started doing high value activities. Instead of doing these control tower conversations or constantly picking up the phone and being real-time communicators, they started looking at longer horizon problems, right? They started looking at more strategic problems. But if you look at this whole aspect, the cost of the people is very, very small. And the whole saving is actually in the logistics spend. So the point I'm making here is, when we as human beings make supply chain decisions, our decisions are 30 times more expensive than our salary. That's the amount of inefficiencies we are bringing into the system. So when I sit in a control tower and I decide to figure out how to tender loads, how to pick a carrier, and how to pick a driver, I have made a decision that has costed my company 30 times more than my salary. Worse, I have also drastically impacted the life of a driver, and I have induced phenomenal volatility in the driver's life. And so it's kind of a very interesting graph that, sometimes when we think automation, it's more about human automation and savings of human labor. And that's not at all what this is. This is more about not making us make decisions so supply chain can be more stable and shippers can save money. Now I'm going to go to long haul. So to summarize, short haul is a complexity between three parties, right? Supplier, logistics provider, carriers, or customer, you and carriers. You're within a confined area, you have a network of pickup and drop off, and the inefficiencies that get created between a shipper's decision, a carrier's decision, impacts the driver, which then impacts you as a shipper by increasing your line haul. When you solve for your driver utilization, carriers get stable, and then your line haul comes down, so your cost inflation goes away. Okay. Now let's talk about long haul. It's a totally different problem. So you all know America is a phenomenally big country, right? Imagine trying to create efficiencies across America. So I'm just going to take an example. The total spend of logistics in America is about $800 billion. Let's further simplify it. The FTL spend, full truckload spend in America is about $350 billion, okay? And let's say you're a shipper or you're a broker, right? And you do about $500 million of spend. So you're doing $500 million in a country that does $350 billion. So imagine how small your volume is, which doesn't allow the carrier to create efficiencies. So when they take your load, they get stuck in a place where now they have to do a horrible backhaul back, or they have to come back empty, or they have to go to a weird location and then come back empty. So what that does is it creates a musical chair. The driver says, this is horrible. I got a good load, and now I have to do all these bad loads to come back because the shipper I'm working for or the broker I'm working for doesn't have enough volume. So what happens is you start seeing drivers playing musical chairs with carriers. So in the long haul world, the assumption has always been it's a carrier relationship is what creates stability. So a shipper will say, I have hundreds of carriers. I meet them for steak dinners. I meet them all the time. I have very good relationships. That has no meaning because the carrier is just like you and I. He sits in an office. He's not the person driving the truck. It's actually the driver that plays musical chairs that creates instability in a carrier's life. When a driver plays musical chairs, shippers start playing musical chairs with brokers and carriers. So a shipper says, okay, I know I have a good relationship with you, but you can't meet my needs for picking up loads. So I'm going to use a different broker, or I'm going to use a different carrier. And in a weird way, this musical chair just continues going on and on. Or a shipper will do an RFQ to lower their cost. And all that happens when they do an RFQ is a new carrier will come into their platform because they will irrationally just bid low just to win the shipper's work. So it's this weird dynamic of musical chairs that is happening between shippers, brokers, and carriers. But at the underlying level, it's happening because the driver is playing musical chairs with the carriers. If the driver did not play musical chairs with the carriers, the shippers would be stable and the cost would be stable. So let me tell you why that's happening. That's happening because of this picture. There is no shipper or broker that is big enough in America to create efficiencies. If you took that example of FTL, which is a $350 billion market, coast to coast, west coast to east coast, north to south, right? If you're moving shipments there and you don't have that level of density, right? You know, I'm sure you've learned this, you've heard of this concept called lane density, right? Lane density is this concept of there is enough volume in that lane to keep drivers happy back and forth, right? To keep them at a sustainable income, right? When you look at America, there are thousands of lanes, right? So you may have lane density in one place, but now you don't have lane density in the second place or the third place. So what ends up happening is this musical chair gets played. Okay, let's compound that further. Now there are carriers, and we all make the assumption that trucking companies are really big, but 96% of the trucking companies are less than 20 trucks, right? So can you imagine trying to build relationships with 240,000 fragmented fleets across America? Imagine how many steak dinners and phone calls we would need to do to have relationships with 240,000 fleets, right? We probably don't even have 240,000 friends on Facebook. Forget trying to build meaningful relationships, right? So this is a very complex problem. The demand is fragmented, and the supply, which is the capacity, trucking, is fragmented. Hence, this can never get solved if a shipper works directly with carriers or a broker works directly with carriers, because nobody is big enough. The biggest in the world is as a broker is C.H. Robinson, and even they can't cross $15 billion of aggregating demand, right? Typically, shippers are much smaller, right? They're a few $100 million in freight. The largest ones are single-digit $1 billion in freight, right? So how do you solve this? This only solves if you aggregate it. If you aggregate all that demand and you aggregate all the supply. So on the left side, it's humanly impossible to manually aggregate this. Can you imagine if we had to manually pick up the phone and aggregate the demand of BMW with Halliburton, with XYZ, right, with Mercedes, with Heinz, and can you imagine if you had to aggregate the carriers on the right side, Bobo Trucking with like Marco Trucking, so on and so forth, right? It's just too much manually, it's humanly impossible. But with a computer, you can suddenly aggregate all that volume on the left side, and you can suddenly aggregate all the capacity on the right side. Now what happens is all the lanes in the country start getting density, and you start creating a super highway in America. Just like we create highways and just like we create those beltways in cities, you'll have an inner loop, and as the city grows, you'll have an outer loop, and as the city grows, you'll have a bigger loop. That starts happening all across America. Lots of loops get created across America. Instead of lanes, they turn into circles, they turn into triangles, they turn into hexagons, and you can end up creating what you call a superhighway. So how did we go about doing that? So we launched a platform last year, which became the largest platform in the oil and gas industry. And now we have expanded that into over the road, so into commodities industry. Is basically 5 people were brought in through AI and through software for aggregation, so that we can create liquidity in the market, so driver utilization can be maximized and trucking cost inflation can be reduced. So the volume comes in from, in these 5 people, the volume comes in from the shippers and the brokers on the left side. Okay. The owner operators are the ones who bring in the trucks. Remember, I mentioned 96% of the fleets in America are less than 26 trucks, less than 20 trucks. So those are the owner operators coming in and bringing in the fleets. Those are the 240,000 fleets, right? Asset owners, these are companies who own power units, companies who own all kinds of assets, reefers, flatbeds, dry vans, dump trucks, pneumatics, specialty trailers, right? They put their assets on the platform. Think about it like eBay, right? Drivers come in. Think about it like LinkedIn, right? Where we basically, all we do is these drivers are connected to these asset owners so that they can lease these assets, or the drivers are connected to these owner operators who can hire these drivers, right? Because they may have 15 trucks, but they may only have 10 drivers. And then the most important piece is these yards and maintenance owners, right? All these assets have to be automatically managed. They have to be automatically secured, right? Because these asset owners are giving you their power units and their trailers and hoping like you will maximize their utilization rate, you'll manage their maintenance, and you just pay them once a month, or whatever the payment terms are. So think about it like Airbnb, and you have this network of Airbnb maintenance yards, right? Who are basically getting access to maintaining these assets, but in return are securing them and managing them with software. So when you put all these 5 players together, where volume comes from shippers and brokers, capacity comes from owner operators, asset comes from asset owners, labor comes from drivers, and the infrastructure is managed by yards and maintenance owners, suddenly driver utilization rate goes up, driver churn goes away, trucking inflation comes down. So as a result, when we did this, typically it takes about 90% churn of drivers that trucking companies lose, and we have been able to reduce that to 8%, and that's an astounding number. And that's basically driven by a few things. That's basically driven by making sure the software is finding work for drivers that meet their preferences. Whenever a driver is asked to do something they don't like, they're going to churn. The second is giving them consistent work so that they don't get anxious when they are having too much idle time and too much deadhead. And third is maximizing their time to maximize their income so that they find the trucking industry more lucrative than the other opportunities of employment that they have in America. So you can kind of see, by building superhighway, by putting all these 5 players together, volume, owner operators, assets, drivers, and infrastructure, we've been able to focus on the most important part, and that's the driver. And all the other people on the top, which is on the left side, are the participants: the shipper, the broker, the carrier, and the asset owner. Last thing I'll share is, as a result, this has drastically improved the acceptance rate in the over-the-road market, the acceptance rate has been very low. Acceptance rate is basically the number of loads that get accepted when a shipper is looking for a carrier, right? Traditionally, it used to be very high. A shipper would want a truck. There was over surplus of trucks, and the acceptance rate would be in the 90%, 90, 95, 98%, right? When you get tightness in the market, which is driver shortage is what the world is calling, and what I'm calling lack of driver utilization, your acceptance rate reduces because the trucking companies have more options. So they're always looking for the most expensive load, and that's why your acceptance rate reduces, right? So because we were able to solve this problem through driver utilization, the acceptance rate has gone up, and more importantly, the earnings of the drivers has gone up. And because the earnings have gone up, they stop playing musical chairs with the carriers, which means the carrier gets stable, which means cost inflation reduces, and which means acceptance rate increases for the shipper. So my last slide, and I'll leave it here, because I think we are ready for questions, is this is a very important piece. I've spent my whole life in the digital kind of digital revolution, right? So this has kind of been my journey as well. When it started with something called business intelligence tools, right? So I'm sure you all have played with ERP systems, where you all remember, we collected all this data, and we spent all this time cleaning the data, preparing the data, and then performing analysis. So so we can build management reports, right? So we could look a month back and see what happened in our business, how can we improve our business, those kinds of things. All the management reports are those, all the financial reports are those, right? There's a lot of tools, I used to use things like Spotfire and Tableau, a lot of statistical models used to get created. But if you kind of look back, that was all looking in the rear view mirror and trying to make decisions by looking at the rear view mirror, okay? Then came this world called digitization, right? Which is this world of visibility. This is kind of what Vorto used to do before we pivoted into the AI automation world. And that was this whole concept of, let's not look at data in the past, let's look at them in real time. So let's not waste so much time preparing the data. Let's just look at it in real time and make decisions in real time. The problem with visibility is this. If you're looking at visibility in real time and the data doesn't change, then it's perfect. You can make decisions. If the data is changing faster than you can make decisions, you're rather better off just using your gut. You'll make better decisions with lack of information at that point than you will. And I know it's a very counterintuitive thing I'm saying. There's a lot of very interesting papers that have been published. I've spent a lot of time in this world because I grew up in this world of building visibility, creating tools so people can make decisions. And what I very quickly learned is, if you give people more than 3 pieces of information and that information changes, their decisions get worse than if you didn't give them any information. So you're kind of better off to go back into the archaic world than actually look at the data. So my learnings here has been is for supply chain to be solved is there should be no data. We should not be looking at data. We should not be analyzing data. The computer should be just making decisions. And the computer should be automating the communication of the decisions so that it could get executed, operationalized in microseconds. When you do that, the results are what I just shared with you. There is no driver shortage, and there is no reason for having trucking cost inflation. It's the same way if you go on Google, right? We don't go and evaluate how did Google come up with the answer. We just see the answer. Or if you talk to Alexa, Alexa just gives you the answer, right? So the point I would make is it's a controversial point, but it's after spending a lot of time in this industry and doing all these projects, is supply chain can only be solved with digital transformation. And digital transformation basically means letting the computer make all the decisions, letting the computer operationalize and communicate all the decisions, and not getting involved in the day-to-day decisions. And if you do that the way I just shared, I have no doubts that supply chain will not be as volatile as what we saw during COVID, and as I believe what we will see over the next 10 years, not just with pandemics, but with just different dynamics, geopolitical as well as national dynamics that are happening in the country. That's it. I finished a minute before time, so we have an extra minute for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So with supply chain and with technology, why do you think there is such a hesitancy for companies to go digital and to utilize this automation?
So there is technology has this. It's a very unfortunate thing, but I would encourage you guys to read a book called Crossing the Chasm. And it basically talks about the adoption curve, like a bell curve of adoption. And typically, any technology, any new technology, so it breaks people who adopt, companies who adopt in segments. Innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and I think laggards, right? Typically, adoption happens by innovators, and that's about 13% of the market. So any industry, 13% of the players you will always see will be adopting things very quickly. What I have learned over the years is a different dynamic. Technology gets adopted in industries that start dying. That's where the adoption happens. Let me give you an example. The manufacturing industry was phenomenally resistant to adopting technology. And suddenly all the manufacturing went overseas because they were cheaper labor. Today, if you look at the manufacturing industry in America, it's fully automated. It's like completely automated, but it's too late. It already left. So until you don't have a catastrophic impact to your business, it's phenomenally hard to almost like rip your thinking process and say, okay, I'm going to go in that direction. So look at the oil and gas industry, right? They went through a phenomenal issue in COVID, and now go on any earnings call, and every oil and gas company is trying to turn into a technology company. Look at the commodity sector. Look at the food processing sector. Look at the car industry, right? The car industry was so focused on being a manufacturing industry. Now with companies like Tesla and all coming in, with electric cars coming in, with autonomous cars coming in, they're trying to turn into a software company, right? Until there is not an existential crisis in your business, it's very hard to go digital. And kind of what I have learned is industries that don't have that existential crisis, they will follow the adoption curve, where 13% of the innovators will first take it, then the early majority, those kinds of things. But in industries that have an existential crisis, you will see that innovators to early majority will happen really quickly. And that's the reason why, as a company, we heavily focus on industries that are going through that crisis versus industries that are very stable, because we believe like the adoption will be much slower.
Okay, great. Obviously, sustainability is kind of a buzzword lately. With what you guys are doing in reducing truckers or whatnot, can you talk about your experience in sustainability and the perhaps the greenhouse gas emission reductions?
Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a perspective. I come from India, and that word doesn't even exist in India. So I'll tell you kind of what that is. Sustainability is when not understood well, never happens. So you can never create sustainability for the environment unless you can create economic sustainability, because nothing happens in the world unless it's economically fed, right? All the incentives in a capitalist economy are driven through economics. So if economics are not aligned, you will never have sustainability. So I'll give you an example of India, right? It's not a developed nation like America, right? And the economic fabric is so weak that nobody has time to have a conversation about carbon emissions. Right now, they're just worried about poverty or what food can they eat in the evening, right? So developed nations get caught in this trap sometimes, where the whole focus is reduce carbon emissions, reduce carbon emissions. Well, if you don't create an economic fabric to do that sustainably, that's never going to happen. So the way we have gone about doing this is this way. We have said we will reduce carbon emissions by creating sustainability economically for the drivers. In other words, if they reduce their idle time, they reduce their deadhead, that reduces carbon emissions. But it more importantly has to create economic value to them, which is that increases their utilization rate and income, which incentivizes them to do the right things. So the kind of very interesting learning that we have had and why we have been so successful with our sustainability push is it has always been rooted to the fabric of increasing productivity. Anytime you increase productivity for trucking, you increase productivity for shippers, carbon emission comes down. And that's kind of our formula: increase productivity, and that reduces carbon emission. And that's the definition of sustainability for us.
Perfect. So on this and, the dynamics of procurement, logistics, operations, purchasing, planning, with Vorto, where do you guys see the maximum short-term return on investment with the least, with the least change that's necessary?
Could you ask me that question again? Sorry about that. Could you ask me that question again?
Yeah, just with the supply chain industry, where do you guys see the maximum short-term return on investment with the least, with the companies maybe perhaps making the least change if they just wanted to initially sign on to, the technology and the automation? Where should they look to do this?
I would say it'll be in logistics. I showed you the autonomous supply chain platform where all parties come together, the supplier, the carrier, and the shippers, or the customers, you and the shippers, sorry, the carriers. That creates, that has change management, right? That involves changing the business processes. So that is kind of, that's more in tune for very progressive companies or companies that are already in that state of mind. But the easiest pathway to enter this, to get the bang for the buck, is what we call the 5F platform, which is this trucking platform that I just shared, which has it has no change management, right? It's basically shippers are providing volume to the network, and they are leveraging the value of aggregation of volume, because we aggregate not just their volume, we mix their volume with other shippers, and then they get this aggregated volume of trucking companies. So the easiest entry point to get the biggest bang for the buck with no change management would be the 5F platform, by leveraging 5F to meet your trucking needs.
Perfect. All right. Let's see. With supply chain positions being added at twice the rate as they're being removed, how does this affect jobs when you go towards automation and digitalizing the supply chain? You hear that automation may be, job killer versus job creator. Where would you fit in on this? And
that's a really good question. So the way I think about this problem is the way supply chain works today. All that is happening is a net zero, right? It creates jobs and you lose jobs, right? Because it's unsustainable, right? It's unsustainable for shippers, it's unsustainable for carriers. I mean, you can see how dispatchers jump between companies, or how drivers jump between companies, right? The automation play in supply chain is not to automate the supply chain jobs. The automation in supply chain is to automate the dynamic decisions, those phone calls that have to be made 24/7. So look at the finance industry, right? Day trading has been automated. That has had no impact to the jobs. Other jobs have got created, right? Because now it has created sustainability, so new jobs have got created. So the way to think about automation, all that needs to get automated is the day trading piece of supply chain, which creates more sustainability for these companies, which allows companies to grow, which allows companies to, I'll give you an example. Our shippers in the oil and gas industry, because they were not sustainable with their cost structure, right? When the oil and gas industry took a cyclicality hit during COVID, they lost more jobs than they've ever lost. And their biggest spend is raw materials and trucking, because it's a commodity industry. When you create sustainability in supply chain, it has a ripple effect where it creates jobs for shippers, customers, and carriers. And you're automating a very small segment of the job profile, and you get to a net positive in job creation versus a net negative the way we are today.
Perfect. All right, we'll end with one last question. What are the biggest risks facing supply chain leaders?
So I would say it depends on which industry you're in, right? Mostly leaders tend to pivot or have a paradigm change in thinking when something pretty tragic happens in their industry or in their business, right? And so there's a catch-up effect. Look at the car industry right now, right? Every car company is drastically pivoting, right? Because of what's happening with the electric cars and like what's happening with the autonomous cars and so on and so forth, right? Look at the oil and gas industry, right? Look at the commodity industry, right? So one of the biggest challenge that supply chain leaders face is, while they may have a very progressive view of where the industry needs to go, if the CEO and the board does not support how supply chain fits in the transformation of their business, they get caught between a hard and a rock place. They may have the best strategy, but they may not get the support. These kinds of paradigm shift of AI and automation only happen if it's top down. They never happen bottoms up. I have never seen it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the biggest challenge that leaders will face if they are not backed by their CEO, by their board. But in cases where there is complete unanimous understanding of the need to do this, to transform their business, I feel the supply chain leaders will succeed the most.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was great. I did want to let everyone know that this is being recorded and it will be shared within our network once available. So we appreciate everyone joining us today. And thank you, Priyesh, for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a good one. Take care.
Everyone have a good one.
Bye.